Item: SCP-781. Object Class: Euclid. Special Containment Procedures: SCP-781 is to be contained within a reinforced cell with a buffer zone at least 25 m x 25 m surrounding it. Subject cell should include a bed, bathroom, and limited forms of entertainment as approved. As soon as subject initiates sleep, usually at around 2000 hours, all personnel present in the main containment chamber should evacuate. All personnel are prohibited from interfering with any situation within SCP-781's chamber between 2000 hours and 7 o'clock, despite any pleas for aid or attention from SCP-781. See Addendum 781-05. SCP-781 is to be interviewed each morning at 7 o'clock by Dr. Glass. Any personnel seeing SCP-781 in their dreams are to report to Dr. Glass for documentation. SCP-781's remains should be collected and placed upon the middle of his containment chamber after any incident resulting in its death. Description: SCP-781 appears to be a human male of Mediterranean descent, approximately, redacted years old as of 10. However, when he was first recovered in 97, he appeared to be approximately, redacted years old. Autopsies performed on the subject have determined SCP-781 to be physiologically identical to average humans. The reasons for any anomalies surrounding SCP-781, including decreased rate of aging, are unknown. It is thought that while asleep, SCP-781 involuntarily manifests his own dream content into a physical form. The majority of these manifestations are hostile and highly dangerous, and on average SCP-781 is killed 3 times per week. Testing using D-Class personnel shows that these manifestations specifically target SCP-781 over other potential victims, but are capable of harming others should they attempt to interfere. It seems that though it is required that SCP-781 be asleep to create manifestations, it is not required that he continue sleeping for their continued existence. Thankfully, these manifestations are not wholly independent of their creator, and always remain relatively close to SCP-781, up to a range of about 9 meters. Manifestations that are even partly forced out of this range immediately disappear entirely. Manifestations seem to linger upwards of 5 minutes even after SCP-781's physical death. Lastly and importantly, it is to be noted that SCP-781 seems capable of auto-resurrection. Though the subject does not exhibit resistance to injury or death beyond the limits of a normal human. 12 hours after SCP-781's physical death, any remains of its corpse disappear. Another 12 hours later, a fully healthy SCP-781 appears within 10 meters of the place of its previous death. Further notes: while SCP-781 seems to display no control over his own dream manifestations, testing has shown that he is capable of perceiving and manipulating the dreams of sleeping subjects in his vicinity. This ability was helpful in determining the source of SCP-781's manifestations.